And we're live. Hey, everyone. This is Andy Hall. And with me today is Vincent Freeman of the YouTube channel, The Babylon Project. I was on one of his shows the other day, or not the other day, maybe a few weeks ago, Thinking Out Loud, a show that he runs on that channel. And we had a lot of fun talking about comedy, talking about life, talking about the universe, talking about everything. Vincent, sir, how are you doing today?
I'm hanging in there, just coming out from a hangover that I had from drinking last night. This is the day after the 4th of July. But I'm hanging in there. I'm on my third cup of coffee, actually. You mentioned you were on your second. I'm on my third. So I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on. It's an honor to be on the show. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, that's great. You know, Best Advice Ever is a show where we have people come on and we get into some really interesting stories sometimes. Sometimes people talk about the worst advice they ever had. And so it's good having you on, definitely. And especially after our conversation on your show, I think that it was just logical to have you on here.
Yeah, we had a great conversation. I learned a lot about comedy because that's the domain that you're primarily in. So it's great learning a lot about that, learning about the comedic culture, because I'm actually thinking about entering the realm of comedy pretty soon. Not as a comedian necessarily, but I'm going to be doing some sort of physics lectures on a new YouTube channel that I'm planning on.
Awesome.
And I'm going to have some comedic elements of it because I don't want to be this monotone, boring professor.
That is really exciting, actually, because we need more people who are able to communicate complicated ideas in a accessible way and in a way that people enjoy them. Mm-hmm. You know, we had someone on my Friday streaming show, Kevin Riom from Second City, the premier improv comedy school and theater in Chicago, and they actually do online courses right now. Kevin's a great guy. If you're interested in learning more about improv comedy, check out that video. And Vincent, you might want to check out their online classes, because what I found out in that conversation is that Second City, their students are typically lawyers or salespeople or other professionals who are looking to amp their game up, their communication style. And so you might want to check it out.
Wow, I definitely will, actually, because I don't consider myself a very funny person. Maybe slightly slide or something like that, but I'll definitely check that out. That's interesting that the main people who are checking this out are like lawyers or salesmen, because those are I never thought about it that way, but yeah, it makes sense.
Neither did I. And that's because what the classes do is that they give you exercises. So they're training you how to be spontaneous, somewhat in the pocket, right? They're not teaching you the certain system of being spontaneous, but they're giving you exercises where you can explore it and train your brain, basically, to say the right thing at the right time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so there's got to be a good science to comedy, right? Because they always say that comedy is subjective, and certainly people can laugh at different things, but there's got to be some science to the timing of it, some science to what it is that we laugh at. So I remember when we were talking about comedy on my podcast, I mentioned that there's two specific things that people react to in comedy: whether or not it's unexpected, and whether or not it deviates enough from reality, from our perception of reality, right? So that's why something like 2 + 2 = fish isn't funny, but there it has to be something along those lines. So I just as a question, I know I'm a guest, but I'm actually really interested in hearing what your stance on this is. What is like the science behind comedy itself? Have you done much research into that?
Broadly speaking, there are two different schools of comedy writers. One of them are the people who follow a certain algorithm. So there's a certain algorithm that you can do when you write comedy that will, the Blazing Wizard Pope, hello, the Blazing Wizard Pope, how are you doing today? So there is an algorithm that you can follow in terms of setup, punchline. And then what's really interesting is there is this intuitive style that you think about a particular bit, and then you wait for a little bit, or you work on it, and then it just lights up in your brain like a Christmas tree. I was listening to NPR one day, this is years ago, and there seems to be this center, this aha center right behind your right ear, I believe. That's where it's located. And when you have these moments, these intuitive leaps, it blows up. And so I think going back to improv comedy, they're probably teaching you how to exercise that muscle, that neurological muscle, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so what I try to do too is to nurture that kind of style of comedy. Now, when you look at my blog post, there's a clear setup punchline, and I don't want to say that my comedy is predictable, because part of it is that I try to nurture this sense of unpredictability, like you would if you're playing poker, for example. I think there's a similarity. I've been playing poker too recently, so trying to learn how to be unpredictable but still useful.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah. So those are the two broad types: basically the intuitive comedy writer and the person who follows the algorithm. And of course, there's a lot of crossover.
Yeah. Comedy is very useful for a lot of things. So it's not just useful for making people laugh, but I think it's also a useful tool for politicizing particular topics. So there's a lot of political comedians out there, and it's a good way for the general public to sort of get informed on just a very broad analysis of politics. So you for instance, talk about you have like very like onion like articles on
Yeah.
Trump, on the GOP. So I think it's useful for that. I think it's also useful for ridicule. So we mentioned this also previously, how one of the topics that is always sort of dissed in comedy is religion. So religion is
Yeah.
very punching bag for comedy, right? And
Definitely.
we talked about why comedy seems to bring forth a certain personality, people who are grieved, people who are um, very intelligent as well. So I think I read a study that on average, people who are comedians tend to have higher IQs than the general population.
There's a lot of abstract thought going on, and as we both know, abstract thought is not evenly distributed amongst the population.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. So it makes sense there. So yeah, I think comedy is very useful for getting people to think about politics or controversial topics. And I think it was comedy actually that first made me question my assumptions about religion. So I grew up in a very Catholic home, very pro-Catholic at the time, and it was listening to people like George Carlin, Louis
Yeah.
C.K., when they would sort of just lambast religion, and it made me start thinking about it differently, right? So this is
Yeah.
like a very, seventh, eighth grade version of me who is barely getting into the topic of conversation surrounding theology and religion. And so back then, obviously, my arguments weren't very sophisticated, but
Sure.
they were being formulated by this notion that religion probably isn't as good as you think it was.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. It opens a door, doesn't it? It opens a door to think about things
Absolutely.
differently.
Yeah, absolutely. And and then like obviously later on in your life, you start thinking about it more deeply, and you start reading the works of whether it be C.S. Lewis, or watching debates with William Lane Craig or Christopher Hitchens. But yeah, back then, comedy really was the foot in the door for my atheism, I suppose, because
Yeah.
listening to Jim Jeffries or Bill Burr and criticize something that I always thought was just uncriticizable. You can't critique religion. That's one of the things that's a sacred goat right there, a sacred cow.
Right.
And seeing these people do so, and do so very openly, do so that to me was one of the reasons why I always cherish comedy. I mentioned
Yeah.
that previously, that comedy is one of the domains where everything should be open. Everything should be open to criticize everything. It doesn't matter how controversial the topic is. It doesn't matter how insensitive it might be. Comedy is the sacred cow that we need to continue to hold sacred for
Oh yeah.
those very reasons. Yeah.
Yeah. Definitely. I think that's a great place to pivot over to the best advice you ever heard.
Mm. Yeah. It was interesting. I was thinking about this the other day. What is the best advice I've ever heard? And I've gotten a lot of advice over the years. Some of it I just kind of put in the back of my head and don't really think about it for quite some time. But I think the best advice I've ever gotten comes from a book, from a popular political polemicist, and I mentioned him earlier on. So the great late Christopher Hitchens is someone who's
Sure.
influenced me in theology. It influenced me greatly in politics. He's someone whom I don't always agree with. For instance, he was
Yeah.
a Marxist. I'm not a Marxist, but I always, whenever I find some disagreement with him, he's one of the people that if I disagree with him, I recheck my facts, because
Yeah.
this guy is someone who clearly knows his metal when it comes to any topic. But I think what really transformed what I ended up being was a book that he wrote called Letters to a Young Contrarian. When I was in high school was when I read this book, and I was in high school, and this was when I started noticing that I had some pretty heterodox views on particular topics. And when you have heterodox views, you enter this domain in which you're concerned that you're not going to be well liked by people because you don't agree with the majority of the population. As a comedian, I'm sure you certainly
Definitely.
felt that. Yeah.
Definitely.
And so I was always nervous about that. I was always nervous about not being liked because, unfortunately, I didn't have the best high school experience. I wasn't a particularly popular person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm with you. I'm with you.
And so this was something that was always on my mind, not being liked. Like, oh God, how can, I always tried to cater towards people, to make sure that I gave off the best version of myself that I could possibly be. And when I read that book, I realized two things. One, not only is it okay to not be liked, but two, not be it takes a certain level of bravery to be open about who you really are. And it's that bravery that we need to prioritize over wanting to be constantly liked. And so when I started my YouTube channel, that was the one book that I was always thinking at the back of my head, because my YouTube channel originally was just focused on talking about philosophy and religion, not so much politics or culture. But I was thinking about it the other day, actually. I'm like, I think I need to change the description of my YouTube channel, because originally it was meant to just be philosophy and religion. But now, literally, given what the current climate of the United States, everything that I'm talking about is literally just culture. It's all politics. It's all domestic policy, I guess. And so I was worried about that for a second, because these are very controversial topics that I actually initially intended to stay away from. But given that it's sort of like the guests that I've had on always want to talk about these issues, which is great.
Yeah.
I'm willing to talk about anything. It's pulling me into that. And so
Sure.
I'm revisiting this area in which I'm worried about people not liking me because I have controversial and heterodox opinions. But I always go back to that book. It's okay to be a contrarian. It's as I said, it takes a certain level of bravery to put your heterodox views out there in the public. And there's a quote from Christopher Hitchens that I always think about, that he says, "I reserve the right to hold." It goes something like this. I don't know by verbatim, but it goes something along the lines of, "I reserve to disagree with anybody, to have my opinion. Anybody who disagrees with me can get in line, take a number to kiss my ass." Beautiful quote. So by virtue of that being the one thing that I always go back on, that it is something that I think about constantly, by virtue of me having heterodox opinions, having controversial, I grew up in a very Hispanic family, and I'm very critical of the Hispanic culture, specifically for their undervaluation of education, I suppose. And so these are controversial opinions. I know I'm not going to be liked because of them, but the fact that a book like Letters to a Young Contrarian really gives me the confidence to keep going forward with these opinions. If people don't like me, that's fine. I'm willing to have conversations with anybody at all on the planet. So I got to be like, that's the most impactful advice that I've ever had. I've had other great advice as well, for sure, but that's got to be the one book that I always go back on, that really just gives me confidence that I'm doing the right thing.
So this is interesting. I just want to say hello to Chris Mallard and Mars in the chat there. How has being more you in public changed your beliefs? Is there some kind of feedback loop going on?
Yeah, there's got to be. So one of the things that I've always tried to think about is, when I talk about topics more, I tend to actually change my opinions quite a bit when I hear myself.
Yeah.
So there are a few things I was that I've changed my opinions on. I used to be of the opinion, for instance, that I don't think people should care too much about representation. So I understand that people feel good and when they see someone of their skin color, their creed represented in the media. And I used to be pretty critical of that. I used to say that, like, when it comes to these sorts of attributes, you really shouldn't care too much about them, especially if we want to live in a pluralistic society. Listening to myself talk about it, and by talking about it, I think about it simultaneously.
Right.
I actually ended up changing my mind on that. And I noticed that this happens quite a bit, actually, where I used to be pretty uh like, I guess, just slightly center left. The more I talk about politics, the more I actually lean left. So I'd probably consider myself at this point a left leaning Pinkerian optimist, I suppose.
Interesting.
And I used to be like, literally, like 3 years ago, I probably considered myself, I shouldn't have said slightly left. I probably would have been fiscally right wing. But I actually ended up changing my mind just by hearing myself speak onto these shows. So that's one of the great things about these podcasts that I
Yeah.
do, is that not only is it a great way to have a conversation with someone who either disagrees with you, or just a fun topic of conversation with someone who does agree with you, but it's a good way to analyze your own arguments, to analyze your own perspectives and change them. And I think that's
Yeah.
great. One of the things we need to normalize is changing one's opinions.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think we're in the business of changing opinions, right? Whether it's
Yeah.
our own opinions or other people's opinions. That is what's great about these kind of forums.
Mm-hmm.
When I think about it, there seems to be a few different programs or systems in our brains about how we think about things. There is the just thinking about it in your own head. There is writing about it, and then there's speaking about it. And each one is a different layer of being able to think about and reflect on it. So once I start writing something, I think about it in a different way. And once I start speaking about something, that also affects who I am and how I think in ways that I wouldn't have gotten to if it was just trapped in my head.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good way to word it. There's, people always run into that problem where they feel like when they're thinking about a topic, that they have this, that they can articulate it perfectly well. But when you speak it and you actually try to put those thoughts into words, it's a whole different monster. Now you run into the problem of whether or not you're actually good at articulating your beliefs. And that's why I
Yeah.
think it's great to talk to people, because it's one thing for me to think about a topic, and I think I'm a genius because I can articulate it so well in my head. I'm so
Right.
brilliant. I'm the next Einstein. But then when you're talking about it and you just barf it all out, you realize, oh shit, it's
Right. It's
I
shit.
really, yeah, it's garbage. This is garbage. That's why I love writing. So I'm writing some art, or I'm trying to write an article right now for Ariel magazine, and the topic that I'm writing about is whether or not 2020 is going to be this huge seismic shift in social and political change. So we have like political change in regards to Trump and the rise of populism, and social change with what's going on right now in the Black Lives Matter movements, as well as even with the pandemic, whether or not the social
Yeah.
distancing guidelines is going to stay relevant even after the pandemic is over, right? Whether or not we're going to
Right.
adopt something like the Japanese culture have adopted, of bowing, and we're no longer going to be shaking hands.
Mm.
So huge, like, the topic is basically just change. And as I'm writing it out, I realize, wow, it's so much harder to actually, because even though in my head I feel like I perfectly understand this issue and I know what I want
Yeah.
to say, writing it out, I realize I need to think about this a lot more than I have, because it's so much harder to actually be able to write down and
Yeah.
properly articulate what it is that you're thinking. That's why I have a lot of respect for authors, for writers, people who are writing for like the Spectator USA, or any journal, online journal. It's just, there's got a lot of work has to go into that, a lot of thought.
Right. So what's your vibe about how the pandemic's gonna change? I don't want you to give away all
Yeah.
about the article, but what's your general read? I guess there's a shitty pun in there somewhere, and I'm sorry, Vincent.
No worries.
What's your general feelings and thoughts on this topic?
I think that when it comes to politics, there's going to be a huge change in the way that we view politics. So uh, there's been a big rise in anti-establishment politics, whether this be right-wing populism or left-wing populism. The Bernie Sanders of the world are getting increasingly popular. They're not the most popular right now. Obviously, if you were to poll most
Right.
people are still pretty centrist. But judging by the way that, and if you like just strictly go by Twitter metrics, then you'd be under the false impression that everybody loves Bernie Sanders or everybody
This is
loves
correct.
Trump.
You got to be careful about the metrics that you look to, that you respond to.
Yeah. So Twitter, I always consider Twitter to be sort of failed social experiment, where it really has just ruined dialogue and civil conversation. But generally speaking, the trend does seem to be in the direction towards populism. And the fact that Trump was able to, people always say that the reason why Trump won is because of racism or sexism. I'm sure those two things played a significant role, right? It's not a coincidence that Trump just so happens to be on the side of racists and sexist and misogynists. But I think the main factor of it was the anti-establishment side of the equation there.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that he is so right-wing, so populistic in that sense. I mean, some people would make the argument that he's actually not as populist as he claims to be. He's pre-establishment. Right. But what matters is the sentiment around what it was that got him in power. And it was this anti-establishment sentiment. And I think that's going to be increasing. You see this not just on the right, but you see it on the left as well. You see the rise of online shows that are revolving around populism. The most popular one right now, I think, is The Hill with Cristobal and Cigar and Jetty. And so I think that's the direction that we're headed in politically wise. Socially wise, there's going to be a huge change in our consciousness, given like on how we view topics such as race relations, and obviously given what's going on in the Black Lives Matter movement, that's something that is really just nuclear to talk about right now. And as well, and when it comes to the pandemic, I think I actually don't know what is going to end up happening after the pandemic is over, whether or not we're going to have new modes of greeting, new modes of social interactions. But it's something that we're definitely going to have to look into, because Bill Gates said this, and I agree with him wholeheartedly when he said that this pandemic is the most predictable thing that we could have ever encountered. It's the most predictable thing that could have happened, and we were so ill-equipped to deal with it. And that is blatantly obvious. So we're going to have to change some things in the future to prevent the next coming one. This wasn't even the pandemic that we were supposed to have. The next pandemic that epidemiologists were predicting was the Nipah virus, which, if I remember correctly, has a fatality rate between like 60 and 80%.
Which is insane. That's insane.
Insanely high. That was the one we were expecting, and it didn't even happen. So that one is still in the future. And there needs to be, we need to have better contingency plans, because even though we managed to spread the curve sufficiently enough to the point where we mitigated the, some epidemiologists were saying that we were looking at deaths between 1 million and 2 million in the United States. Luckily, we're not there yet. Who knows? Given the second wave that we're dealing with right now, it might. But there needs to be a huge change in the way that we view these sorts of existential problems. Pandemic. So that's a quick, brief synopsis of what's to come in that article.
Well, dude, I'm looking forward to reading the article when it does come out.
If it comes out.
If it comes out, right.
I started summer school, and I've been so just busy studying and for my exams that I haven't really had time to focus too much on my reading or my writing.
I remember taking summer classes as an undergraduate, and they were crazy. Very concentrated. You're in the chute pretty much. Oh, God. And it was horrible.
I'm taking 2 5-week intensive courses, so I literally have no breathing room.
Yeah. Well, go with a fictitious God there. Vincent, Well, hey, that was some great advice about being yourself, and not just being yourself, but we were able to talk about how being able to be in the world actually changes who you are and your opinions. I thought that was some really insightful advice, and our conversation was fantastic. I personally got a lot out of it.
Oh, I'm glad. That actually makes me feel great. Wow, look at that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's and I really do think that is hugely important, because it is so taboo for people to openly change their minds. I mean, and I can understand the problem with hugely political figures that have hundreds of thousands of followers on Twitter, because if much of your popularity is reliant on particular viewpoints that you have, it could be catastrophic to your reputation if you change your mind. I mean, there are some
Yeah.
people out there who have been accused of being captured by their audience. I won't say who specifically, but there are certainly people out there, and
We can talk about that when the broadcast is over, baby.
yeah, no worries.
Yeah.
And that is a huge problem. And so I
Huge.
think really needs to be normalized changing your, like, being able to change your mind. There was a clip the other day, not the other day, like the other year, of Jim Jeffries interrogating someone like Jordan Peterson.
Yeah.
And the topic of conversation was the gay wedding cake, right? And he said, like, well, if we don't, if we view it very, very negatively, and it's illegal to deny someone service on the basis of race, how is that any different on the basis of sexuality if it's also an immutable characteristic? And Jordan Peterson was silent there for a second. He said, you know what, you might be right. I might have to
I remember that clip, actually. I remember that clip, and I think that really speaks to bravery of being right there in the moment and saying, it's like, maybe I don't know, maybe I haven't thought all this through, and I think that we should applaud those moments.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And what was sad to see was that a lot of people were making fun of Jordan Peterson, and I have heavy disagreements with him. I think
no, me too.
Yeah,
me too.
But it's one of those things where, like, is this really the type of social temperature that we want to have, like, where we make fun of people for thinking honestly about topics and maybe even potentially changing their opinion? Like, that's a good thing that happened there. That was a good conversation, right? And unfortunately, people just resorted to making fun of him, and some people were even saying, like, this is one of the most basic arguments that the other side has, and yet like, one of the most basic arguments put you at pause. I mean, you could view it that way, but at the same time, isn't it a good thing that he was willing?
It's fantastic.
It's great. Yeah. So,
if anything, I would be thanking him for considering it and reflecting on it.
Yeah, and it's important. But again, like, it goes back to the whole idea where most people don't have that level of bravery. Most people would still stick to their guns because it's some sort of post hoc rationalization just based on previous opinions that they've had, or simply because, as I said, they're captured by their audience and they're just trying to cater to it. Now, obviously, you can't try to read people's minds and try to figure out what it is, which one it is, but the solution to, regardless of which one it is, the solution has to be just normalizing the ability to change your mind.
True enough. Wise words, my friend. Vincent, where can people find you online?
You can find me on Twitter at Latent Physicist. I'm relatively silent on there, but recently I've been more and more vocal. You can also find me on my YouTube channel, the Babylon Project, where I host 2 podcasts now. One is Thinking Out Loud, and the other one is the Babylon Cast. I recently had a great conversation with Zara K about changing people's minds. Actually, how do you change people's minds? So you can find me there. You can also find me on Instagram. Actually, I just recently opened one up for my YouTube channel called Babylon Project YT. So I can't imagine anybody's interested in my personal life, but if you are, hey, there you go. So you can find me on all those things.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for coming. I'm going to say that over again. Thanks for coming on. The best advice ever, Vincent. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's an absolute honor to be on here. I think you're a great guy. I think you're doing some great work. So it's great that I'm able to be a part of your work.
Yeah, dude. Yeah, thanks again. All right. Hey, I just want to say hello to David, who I just noticed is in the David Woolley. And of course, I'll say, hello, David. Glad to see you.
He was also on
there. Yeah, that's great. Yeah. Yeah, we're squaring the circle. There's some kind of circle that's being circled right now with us being on each other's shows. But hey, once again, Vincent, thanks for coming on. I wish you all the success in your torturous summer classes.
Yeah, I'll do my best. I'll get A's just for you.
Okay, very good. Thanks a lot, man. And